Hello, everybody. This is Marianne Steff from the European Disability Forum. I'm really happy you can be here today. I'm just wanted to tell you we're gonna start in about 2 minutes to wait for more attendees. So I'm gonna mute myself and then we start in about 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay, everybody, I think we can start. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased you could join us today. I am Marianne Steff, and I work for the European Disability Forum, which is a regional organization of persons with disability, so a DPO, and we are based in Belgium. So today I'm here with a number of colleagues to support me when it comes to logistics. I'm here with my colleague Raquel, my colleague Lucia. We'll also have Rochelle for the captioning and Ferdinand for the captioning, for the sign language interpretation. I'm sorry, Ferdinand. So this seminar is organized by EDF, and it's the second one. We had about a month or two ago in October, we had one to launch our new program, which is called Innovation to Inclusion, and it's a program that we call i2i. So that program is funded by the UK Department for International Development, DFID. So today we have about 59 people registered, which is great, and is accessible with captioning, and the link is available in the chat box. So that's where if you click on the link, you can have access to captioning. And we also have access to international sign interpretation. This webinar will be recorded and later accessible on EDF website. So when we're going to send you a thank you note, you will have access to all the information that we share today. So today we're going to be focusing on one aspect of the i2i program, and it relates to developing, testing, validating, and sharing learning from a tool developed by the OHCHR in the framework of a project called Bridging the Gap. So now this tool has been taken and is being further developed within the i2i project to directly improve advocacy around social protection and employment in Kenya and Bangladesh for people with disability. So we have three wonderful speakers here to tell you more. I'm really excited to hear their presentation. So in terms of format, we're going to have each speaker talking for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then it will be followed by questions from the audience. So all the questions, you will have to write them down, and I will read them to our speakers. So our first speaker is Mr. Juan Ignacio Perez Bello, and I'm really sorry for my bad Spanish accent. He's from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. He's been working on Bridging the Gap 1 project, and today Juan will speak about the tool that has been developed Within this project, and it's based on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So Erwan, the floor is yours. You have 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you. And you just need to unmute yourself. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for this opportunity to share with you all about the work that we have been doing. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you all. Just to double check, I would like to ask you if you are already able to if it's being projected in the screen. I hope so. So as it was anticipated, I participate in the work of Bridging the Gap 1, which is a EU-funded project led by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN. This project has begun in by the end of 2016, and I joined the project in February 2019, this year. This project was conceived before the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, with the objective to contribute to the socio-economic inclusion, equality, and non-discrimination of persons with disabilities by 1. Supporting the implementation and monitoring of the CRPD through the elaboration of human rights indicators. We will go more in depth on that. And 2, supporting SDGs implementation guided by the CRPD. And for that, we are developing policy guidelines and data sources guidelines. I will briefly explain what those are. The human rights indicators on the CRPD is a tool which is based on a methodology that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has since 2012, and there is a publication on that. They seek to cover all articles of the CRPD from articles 1 to 33. Sometimes there are groups of articles because of the thematic proximity, let's say. We will focus in the examples of 27 and 28 a bit later in this presentation. Where relevant, these indicators incorporate SDGs indicators coming from the SDGs indicators framework. Of course, where it belongs in terms of theme under each CRPD article. We will see today under social protection many SDGs indicators, and the added element there is usually disaggregation by disability status of said indicators. These indicators were developed between 2017 and 2019. They're about to be finalized. They're in the last stage of review by the program manager of this project, but they were produced through a process that included validation meetings with stakeholders from 5 participant countries in this project that were Ethiopia, Jordan, Moldova, Nepal, and Paraguay, representatives from the disability focal point of their governments, from national human rights institutions, from national statistical offices, and organizations of persons with disabilities. And in addition, there were online consultations throughout 2019 in which we receive input from other UN agencies, OHCHR, national human rights institutions, organizations of persons with disabilities, and civil society organizations, including, of course, the European Disability Forum and some of its members. In the meantime, while we are finalizing, or where the last versions need to be reviewed, the draft versions are published in the OHCHR website and are the drafts of July and August 2019. So the OHCHR methodology I was mentioning, distinguishing between structural indicators that measure commitments, we will see, but most of them have to do with adoption or enactment of legislation, enactment or adoption of policy plans, strategies, legal requirements, etc. In the idea of measuring what the country or state is committing to do. Then process indicators that observe, measures, the efforts and action by the state. For instance, proportion of staff trained on a particular disability-related topic in a particular ministry. Proportion of requests of, for instance, procedural accommodation granted in the justice system. Just to mention a few, you'll have the chance to read much more. And then outcome indicators, which is or reflects the result in the enjoyment of the right by the right holders, meaning by persons with disabilities. Just to put an example, the rate of persons with disabilities on employment compared to others. Let's take a look now at how it has been done for Article 27 and 28. I will change screen to a Microsoft document just to give an example. I'm trying to be aware of time. For instance, here in the screen it is projected in a table format, all the indicators under Article 27, and we find, for instance, as a structural indicator, 27.1, legislation enacted related to all aspects of work and employment and training and employment services which are inclusive of persons with disabilities. And within a footnote, there are some elements that developed further on what does that mean. So one can use this indicator to check if the national legislation, even if it is a piece of legislation or many others, cover the different elements included here. Similarly, and to complement that one, we include an indicator that is drafted in a negative form, which says 27.2, no provisions in legislation or regulations which directly or indirectly restrict employment on the basis of disability, which will be the case, for instance, of legislation depriving some persons with disabilities from their legal capacity to engage in employment contracts, for instance. We can see among the process indicators that we have, for instance, there is one on awareness raising campaigns and activities to promote inclusion and inform employees and individuals of their rights and responsibilities as they relate to employment and employment services. This kind of indicator is there throughout the different tables for the different articles of the convention. I realize that I have 2 minutes left, so I will speed up a little and maybe avoid some examples in social protection. As outcome indicator here in employment, we have, for instance, the employment rate of persons with disabilities as compared to others. They should tend to be similar, those employment rates. And then, just to put another example, the issue of the disability salary gap, which has been included as an SDG indicator, as far as I remember, thinking more for gender salary gap, but we include the disaggregation by disability, which is another. So here you see another example of outcome indicator. And then moving to social protection, and just to mention one thing, one very important point that we have here as a structural indicator is no legal regulatory provisions or policy measures which requires renouncing to legal capacity by persons with disabilities, of course, to access social protection, or that impose any conditionality which persons with disabilities would not be able to fulfill. For instance, attending a school where there is no inclusive education. I highlighted other examples. You will have the chance to go through these tables on your own, but I just wanted to mention a few and show you this table. Of course, it's also accessible, and they will also be accessible in digital accessible formats. There have been some concerns regarding these indicators, most of them related to the length and the number, but the idea was to be as comprehensive as possible, not to miss anything. And we have received input of different kinds throughout the process. Just very briefly to conclude, other two products are being developed by this project, which are more directed to policymakers, which are the data sources guidelines that will link SDGs indicators and CRPD indicators with existing data sources. This is to give policymakers that might not be aware an idea that a specific kind of information is available for them to use, or that other countries produce it, so they can start thinking of producing it, being statistical data or administrative data. And then the other product will be policy guidelines, also directed to policymakers, on which for these two topics, employment and social protection, we have goal 1 and goal 8 that will be very relevant. There will be two sections, specific sections on both of them. And the idea is to provide some more general guidance to policymakers to implement SDGs, including persons with disabilities, including key actions. So in this case, it will be less comprehensive, but trying to connect with the human rights indicators and the data sources where appropriate. I apologize that I went a little bit over the time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions there might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. It's very interesting. And so if you have any question, you can just write them in a section called question. And the first one I have is related to to the countries. So where have these indicators been tested? You mentioned it briefly, and where are they going to be taking? Are they going to be taken in other countries?
Thank you very much for the question. The indicators have been developed with the participation of stakeholders from those 5 countries I was mentioning. They have been utilized in different activities recently in Paraguay, but they are illustrative indicators developed thinking to be useful for any kind of context. But as it is mentioned in the OHCHR methodology, of course, when one translates these indicators into the national context, of course, they need to be adapted to the national environment, the national priorities at some point, and the national administration to see to check, okay, what information I have can I use, what information I don't have I need to start producing, what is more feasible at this point, what can inspire a strategic plan on persons, or what can be used in a strategic plan on the rights of persons with disabilities. That of course very much context related. In addition, the tool can be used in terms more of let's say monitoring without necessarily getting into a national plan, simply as a guide to check what's happening and what's not happening. And we have received good feedback on this very practical kind of use by organizations of persons with disabilities.
Okay, thank you. And the other question you receive is, what are the state's obligations regarding these indicators?
No, the indicators reflect the jurisprudence developed by the CRPD committee in its work of interpretation of the CRPD. The state's obligations emanate from the CRPD. This helps and provides guidance on what those obligations are by indicating what needs to be checked. But I would not say that states have an obligation towards these indicators. I would say that these indicators might contribute to facilitate identification of the obligations under the CRPD and provide a practical tool to test to monitor and set objectives to implement the CRPD.
Yeah, so the state has to implement the CRPD, but they don't necessarily have any obligation regarding to these indicators. It's probably more to help them.
Yes, indeed. It's OHCHR. It's fulfilling its guidance, technical guidance role. States do not have to endorse, do not have to approve, do not have to do anything regarding the indicators. They might make use of them, and civil society might encourage them to make use of them.
Is a tool, and actually, so thank you so much, Juan, because I'm checking the time and we need to already move on to our next speaker, Maeve. But I think what is going to be interesting with Maeve is that we're going to see the example of this tool used in a particular context. So let me go back to my notes. So we're going to have our second speaker, Maeve O'Reilly from Leonard Cheshire. So Maeve is the policy advisor on data and disability. She managed the disability data portal on which the SDG monitoring tool will be hosted. So the SDGs monitoring tool is based on the OHCHR indicators. So that's going to be used in the i2i program. So Juan, thank you very much. And I'm going to give you the floor, Maeve. You have about 8 to 10 minutes max, and then we'll take some questions afterwards.
Thank you, Marion. I have some slides. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen. I'm not sure if you can point me towards the button. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Is that working?
Yeah, it's working. We can see your presentation.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So as Marion described, I will go through how we've used the indicators that Juan has talked about to develop a monitoring tool focused on employment and social protection, and how this will be implemented through the i2i Innovation to Inclusion program. So for anyone who couldn't join the introductory webinar on i2i, I just wanted to quickly recap on the 3 levels that it operates across and where the tool fits in the context of this program. So it operates at an individual level, at the private sector level, and at the government kind of policy level. So clearly this tool fits in under this output, the government level, and it's specifically to support DPOs to engage in evidence-based advocacy and engage in accountability processes related to employment and social protection policies in Kenya and Bangladesh. So to start with, I wanted to give an overview of, sorry, I keep changing my screen. Hopefully you can see that. An overview of what's in the tool that we've developed. So it can be broken down pretty simply into 3 parts. The first part is an introduction to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Sustainable Development Goals, and it outlines the links between those 2 frameworks, particularly in relation to employment and social protection. The second part is the actual assessment framework. So this is where the indicators come in. So the assessment framework is to support DPOs to sort of go through step by step the Articles 27 and 28 and to check against the indicators how well their government is doing in complying with these two articles. So it's across a kind of a scale. So on one end of the scale, a champion in government would be fully complying with the articles. So the legislation and policies in place would fully reflect the CRPD standard. And then it goes kind of down the scale towards so established, initiating, and all the way down to weak or restrictive, which would be a government which is not in compliance with Articles 27 and 28. So the assessment framework breaks down the articles piece by piece and sets out the indicators developed by the OHCHR so that DPOs can kind of go through them in a kind of step-by-step manner and then assign a rating to their government based on what they find. And then the third part of the tool outlines how to advocate for changes. So through the assessment process, DPOs will identify areas which their government are weaker on, and then they may choose that as their advocacy focus. And this part of the tool as well outlines how this advocacy can take place within the framework of the SDGs, because of course the SDGs have so much political will behind them and motivation at the moment, and it's so important that SDG implementation is human rights compliant. And then just to say kind of where the tool will sit. So at the moment, it's a paper-based document, but it is being developed into an online tool. So it will be a digital kind of process, and it will sit on the Disability Data Portal, which I'll show you in just a moment. And then just to note as well that the tool will be supported by online and in-person training for DPOs that will use the tool. And this training is being developed by consortium partners within the i2i programme, which include Leonard Cheshire, Equal Measures 2030, CBM and EDF working together on this training. So just to show you a picture of the Disability Data Portal for anyone who's not familiar with it. This is an existing website that was developed by Leonard Cheshire together with DFID for the Global Disability Summit in 2018, and it currently provides a snapshot of disability data across 40 countries. And so we're using this existing resource to host the monitoring tool that DPOs will be able to access via this website. So during the pilot, it's going to be accessible only through a hidden page. So only the DPOs involved will be able to access it. But then once the data has been inputted by DPOs, the results and the evidence will be published on the Disability Data Portal. So people will be able to see the rating that DPOs have assigned to their government based on the process that they go through with this tool. I wanted to talk quickly about how it was developed. So it was a partnership with Humanity and Inclusion and OHCHR. So we worked together earlier this year to test the tool with DPOs. So there was a workshop jointly organised by our 3 organisations in January, and then HI, Humanity and Inclusion, organised a workshop in Myanmar in August as well. So this was to get feedback from DPOs and to incorporate their feedback into the next iteration of this tool. And the DPOs involved were from Kenya and Bangladesh as part of i2i, and then Humanity and Inclusion, their target countries are Myanmar and Ethiopia. As I mentioned, the online version of the tool is in development. So we had our first user tests of the online digital tool last week. And DPOs from Bangladesh and Kenya and some consortium partners were involved in this initial phase of testing and have given their feedback to the web developer, who's now creating a more full and complete prototype for the next round of user testing in January. So the next round of testing will be more kind of widespread and more of a rigorous testing process. So if anybody listening is interested in being involved in the next phase of testing, I'd love to hear from you. So please do let me know. And then just to point out, in case there were any questions, the online tool will be designed to be fully accessible. Okay, so finally, I wanted to talk through the process we've set out for implementing and delivering the training around this tool. So I have a bit of a timeline in purple at the bottom, which will begin to kind of pop up as I go through my slides, but just to point out that this is at the moment an indicative timeline. Dates have not been fully confirmed. So the first stage is a first initial training webinar, which will be an online accessible webinar. This will introduce part 1 of the tool, which I discussed earlier. So outlining the links between the CRPD and the SDG framework and the role of civil society in accountability for the CRPD and the SDGs. So it's kind of an introductory training webinar for DPOs to start off. The second stage is an in-person workshop. So there'll be one workshop in Kenya and one workshop in Bangladesh. This workshop will go through in detail the assessment framework. So this will be going through all of the indicators, making sure everybody understands the indicators and the scale from championing down to weak or restrictive, and how they might go about assigning a place along that scale. This workshop will also examine data sources, so coming up with a plan for how the DPOs will go and collect the data in order to input into this tool. And collectively, DPOs will come up with an action plan for collecting this data so that the whole burden of data collection doesn't fall on just one or two organizations, but that everybody is working together as a group to input into this tool. The next stage is the data collection period. So following the action plan that's been agreed in the in-person workshop, DPOs will go about collecting and sourcing the data so that they can input against these indicators at the next stage. Happens to our second in-person workshop. So during this workshop, we will kind of bring everything together. So DPOs will consolidate the data that they've collected. As I said, they'll input into the tool as a group. So there won't be kind of 10 different versions of a report inputted. It will be one group input together. So they will work together to kind of assign a rating, establish, championing, initiating, weak, restrictive for each of those elements of Article 27 and 28 into the tool. And then once that's the data sources have been validated, the evidence that they've collected will be displayed on the disability data portal as a citizen-generated data source for other people to also have access to. Then the second part of this workshop will move on to advocacy. So during the data collection process, DPOs will identify areas that perhaps are weaker, and then from that they will choose the issue or issues that they wish to focus their advocacy on. So together they'll come up with an advocacy strategy which they'll implement in the next stage. So this, of course, is all to be decided. So yeah, it's up to DPOs how they would like to direct their advocacy, but there will be a focus in particular on engaging in accountability mechanisms related to the SDGs. And just to point out that both Kenya and Bangladesh governments are presenting voluntary national reviews in 2020 on their progress towards the SDGs. So that is one opportunity that's been identified. And then finally, 1 year later, the plan is that DPOs will come back together and go through the data collection process again. And the purpose of this is just to compare changes across the year, maybe new laws and policies that have been implemented, or maybe new data has become available, so they can input into the tool again. And then using that evidence, go on and plan kind of the next phase of their advocacy. So that's kind of a rough timeline that we have in mind. I will leave it there for now, but I'm happy to go into more detail in the questions. So I will just hand back over to you, Marion. Thank you.
May, thank you so much. It's very interesting, but I had just want to comment for people who don't really can read the guidelines. Will you be able to just sorry, the time frame? Will you be able to see briefly exactly
Yes.
when they are?
Yes, apologies. Yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out. So the first training webinar is proposed to take place in January 2020, early January. The first in-person workshop on how to use the tool is proposed for I've written January, February, but I reckon February is more realistic. The next phase, which is data collection, we still need to establish how long that will be, but it will likely stretch into March 2020. Then the second workshop, inputting everything into the tool and planning the advocacy strategies, is likely to take place around March. And then DPOs delivering their advocacy strategies, that's kind of an ongoing process from March onwards until the next phase of data collection, which will take place kind of February, March 2021, 1 year later than the initial phase of data collection.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I think it would be interesting to mention that EDF will be involved in that project, and we're going to be focusing mostly around the advocacy strategy. So around between March 2020 and February 2021, we'll be working with our colleagues, DPOs in Kenya and Bangladesh, to develop together some advocacy strategy based on the result of the data collection. Maybe, is that correct?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, I should have mentioned that.
Yeah, no, but it's fine. It's fine. Can you tell us, because you're now in a phase of testing that portal online, how is it like? Where are we exactly in the development of the portal?
Yeah, sure. So we're working with an agency called Liquid Light, which is a web development agency. So the stage they're at the moment is kind of mapping out how the different elements of the tool will work online. So they've created a very kind of initial prototype, which is essentially a questionnaire style. So it will take users through each element of the article, and questionnaire style. DPOs will be able to fill in whether or not their government is championing or established or initiating and so on, and then to fill in their data sources. So they're just working on how to make that process user friendly. So they came up with a prototype that they've tested with like various different users. But now incorporating all that feedback, the next prototype may look a little bit different. So that's kind of the phase we're at the moment.
Thank you. And then next question will be like okay, this is very specific to the i2i program and for Kenya and Bangladesh, but do you think that tool online are we going to be able to use it for other countries? Is i2i consortium going to be happy to share the tool and expand it further?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, so as I mentioned, we have worked with Humanity and Inclusion as well on this tool, and they've used it with their DPO partners in Myanmar and Ethiopia. I can say that the kind of paper report version of the tool will be uploaded online as well, so that content will be available for other people to use. The digital version at the moment will be kept to the i2i DPOs just for the purposes of testing, so that any kind of changes that need to be made can be incorporated before it's shared more widely. But yeah, this definitely is something that we would love to be shared more widely than just those two countries.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. I see some people put their hands up, but I won't take any question. I won't unmute everybody because it's just too many people. So if you have any questions, just not hesitate to write them in the questions section. I'm concerned by time, so Maeve, thank you so much. I think this is really interesting, and I'm gonna go on to our next speaker, who is Mrs. Angeline Okola-Charles. And Angeline Okola started off her career at the National Council of Churches of Kenya, working in the advocacy department on youth and persons with disabilities. She then moved to the and I'm sorry, my English is not very good, so to the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network of the World Council of Churches, where she's now the program coordinator. So Angeline O'Connor today will speak about her organization experience engaging in accountability work on the SDGs and the CRPD in Kenya. So Angeline, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Hello, can you hear me? Am I loud? Okay, so I am very happy and privileged to get this opportunity to be part of this webinar. And I must say that it's truly an honor to represent my organization, which, as you rightly said, is the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network, which in short is EDAN. And it is an initiative of the World Council of Churches to ensure that disability concerns remain in the agenda of the churches through advocacy for participation, inclusion, and active involvement of persons with disabilities in all aspects of spiritual, social, and the development life of the church and the society. So we actually work through the councils of churches, and in Kenya, we work through the National Council of Churches of Kenya. And I will give the experience of my organization, which is a DPO of persons with disabilities who are involved in the issues of disabilities, but using the church as a platform. And we are also part of the project that Niv has just spoken about on Innovation to Inclusion project in Kenya. And maybe just to give us an overview of what Kenya has in terms of disability. We do have a Persons with Disabilities Act of 2003. And the government has also established and operationalized the functions of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities. And we also have the National Development Fund for Persons with Disabilities. Both the fund and the council were established under the Persons with Disabilities Act of 2003, which I've just mentioned previously. And the aim is to support disability programs in Kenya, including financial support to institutions and organizations that provide services to persons with disabilities. And then in Kenya, we also have the Constitution of Kenya of 2010, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. And Kenya also ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we also have the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, which is the monitoring agency of the CRPD. And I also have to add that Kenya has also given her commitment to the implementation of the Agenda 2030 for Development, that is the SDGs. And this has actually worked out very well for us because the agenda just found when Kenya was coming up with its own development agenda, which incidentally is also Agenda 2030. So I could maybe start by asking what exactly is the role of the DPOs in the convention process. And I would say that our DPO has been involved in the negotiations of the convention as we were part of the government delegation to the ad hoc meetings. And in the early stages of the negotiation, that is, I think from late 2003 to 2005, the disability fraternity in Kenya used to hold national consultations. And EDAN was part of these consultations. And at some point, our director then was the co-convener of these consultations. And the meetings helped to shape our approach of the delegation, bringing forth ideas of disability organizations. And in these meetings, we also discussed and agreed that there would be a need to have a method of monitoring the convention in order to make it significant and to have an impact. And so on 30th of March in 2007, when Kenya signed the convention, we were really very excited. However, we started pressurizing the government almost immediately to commit and ratify the convention. And so on 5th of May in 2008, the Kenya government ratified the convention. And following the ratification, our focus now as the disability fraternity in Kenya shifted to educating the disability community about the convention and ensuring its implementation. And as an organization, what we did is we printed around 1,000 copies of the convention, and we started having national conferences where we were emphasizing the need for the government to come up with a clear mechanism for implementation. Because apart from just teaching persons with disabilities and sensitizing the society on the convention, we also wanted it to be very participatory, and started asking for the monitoring and reporting of the convention to be in a participatory approach. And at the end of all these consultations, we had a major consultation that was national, and we came up with an implementation framework which we shared with the government. And I could say that it was a very good opportunity because at that same time, Kenya was also in the process of coming up with a new constitution. And so the convention played a big role in coming up with Article 54 of the Constitution of Kenya on persons with disabilities, which is actually under the Bill of Rights, and more specifically on the specific application of this Bill of Rights. And following that, the government of Kenya submitted to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in conformity with the Article 35 of the Convention, its initial state party report in August of 2016. And during this particular submission, the organizations of and for persons with disabilities working on promoting the realization of the rights of persons with disabilities were part of the process to ensure that the report is representative of the prevailing situation in the country. And after the submission of the report, we converged again together and came up with an action plan on the implementation of the recommendations that were made by the committee. And this is what we are currently implementing. I should also add that as an organization, we are also part of the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Disability by the Kenyan government. And so we meet every 3 months to receive reports on this action plan. Regarding the SDGs, I would like to also mention that being part of the church work, we have an interfaith group on disability, and an interfaith group on the SDGs. And our organization is part of this interfaith group on SDGs, which meets twice in a year. And after 2 years, we do have a bigger forum that brings together people from the African region to come and meet and report on the achievements so far of the SDGs. But then in Kenya, we are also part of the SDGs Kenya Forum, which brings together civil society organizations working across the 17 SDGs. And the forum has always been a very exciting place for us to learn, to share, and also to really come up with a coordinated engagement on how we are going to make sure that these SDGs are really implemented by our government. These forums have the private sector, the media, and the academia, apart from just the CSOs, of which we also belong as part of the CSOs in Kenya. So what has been happening is we have been having national capacity building seminars and dialogues on SDGs, in which we raise awareness and build the capacity of the federations of persons with disabilities, not only in Kenya, but also in Eastern Africa region, to engage their governments in planning, implementing, and monitoring of SDGs, especially during these early stages when some of the countries are actually coming up with an action plan on implementing the SDGs to ensure that disability issues are not left out. And it is very interesting because when we do that, we come up with action plans. And in these action plans, we always input how we are going to be part of the national reviews that come up in form of the voluntary review reports that our governments hand to the higher level political forums, meetings in New York. And Miv had just spoken about one of the voluntary national review reporting that will take place in 2020. And we have already started discussions around that because as an organization, we are actually the ones that are championing the MDG 10 as the convener. And as convener, what we do is we train on how to report on this MDG, after which we gather and consolidate the inputs from our constituency and hand them over to the SDG Kenya Forum, which goes ahead to submit a progress report to the government. We do that every 2 years, and the first progress report as the SDG Kenya Forum was made in 2017, and the second one we have just done it this year. And so we have been involved in these two engagements on SDGs and CRPD. Let me go straight to the challenges that we have had as a DPO. We have been very successful as a country, maybe I could say, compared to the other countries in the region, especially in Africa, on mainstreaming disability rights and contributing meaningfully and effectively in the discussions on mainstreaming. But even though we are at the table and we are promoting our issues around inclusion of disability rights, one of the challenges that we find is that sometimes we discuss all these issues with the government and with other actors, but they're not reflected in the outcomes of the documents of these meetings. And the second challenge is also the issue of participation of DPOs. Most of us do not really have the capacity as well as the knowledge to be able to adequately participate in these discussions. And so most of the time you'll find that it's just few DPOs that are able to really take part in the discussions at that level. And the third challenge is sometimes we are not aware. I must confess that there are instances where our government has presented a report mentioning a lot of achievements that the country has made, maybe in the area of CRPD or SDGs, but we are not made aware because it's very difficult to get information from the government. And one other challenge is that it's very important that we build alliances with other organizations, and building alliances actually means resources. So it's not just with the DPOs, but we also need to build alliances with service providers and other civil society groups. And I really hope that this i2i project gives us that particular opportunity. And lastly, maybe the challenge that I would say is that we have several action plans as a country in Kenya. We have an action plan on the implementation of the recommendations made by the committee on the convention. And then we also have an action plan of the Global Disability Summit commitments. And sometimes it's very hard for us to really follow up on these action plans as a DPO, because our government has committed to the Global Disability Summit commitments, but also at the same time to the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we also, of course, encounter resource constraints because to do all these things, we need to really be able to have the resources that are needed and for our capacity to be built. I want to stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I particularly enjoy it because I find it really helpful to get a really good overview like this about the situation in Kenya when it comes to the CRPD and also the SDGs. And I see your organization is very involved. We have only 2 minutes left. I'm very sorry about that, but can you briefly tell us if the how is the disability movement, like the DPOs, are they very all engaged like your organization? And if you manage to cover all the different disability constituencies, and I think that's the only question, I'm so sorry, we're going to be able to take.
Hello? Okay. I'm saying the question is very important because, as I have mentioned in our challenges, the challenges are that for us to adequately engage in all these processes, we really need to have the resources, first of all, and then also we need to have the capacity to be able to engage, as well as also the knowledge on all these processes. And to do all that, we really need to be adequately resourced. And unfortunately, DPOs are not having a pool where we can get some funding that can actually be able to make us be fully engaged in the process. That is the way I might answer that question. It's basically the issue of the capacity and also the issue of lack of awareness because Kenya is also a big country, so we are not able to reach all the DPOs, especially those at the very grassroots. And then, of course, there is the issue of the financial bit where we need to have enough resources to be able to engage.
Okay, thank you. And then, of course, I think I see us as a DPO also is also to make sure we really try to reach all the different constituencies. And then it's also complex. We receive a lot of other questions, but I'm sorry, I have to be strict with the time. So I think if you have any question, anybody can send that to me and I can send them to the speakers, or you can obviously contact them directly. What we will do, my colleague will send you a thank you note, and you're going to receive the PowerPoints if the speakers accept to share them, as well as the transcript, the video of the sign language interpretation, and I think that's it. And they're also going to be on our website. So thank you very much. We will have another webinar in January, and we still need to think about the theme. But we'll post it online, and you will get more information very soon, before the holiday or after. So thank you again, and I wish you an excellent end of the day. Bye-bye.